Welcome to episode 1 of Game On Wisconsin's The GOAT. Hit it. What is up, Packers fans? Welcome to episode 1 of The GOAT, a special mini-series. I'm Ryan Bowman. I'm joined by my friend here, Mark Beech, author of The People's Team, an illustrated history of the Green Bay Packers. Mark, how you doing, my friend?
I'm good, Ryan. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm really excited to get into this series, and I know when we first started chatting about this, it was, I think, last off season, and there was all this conversation about who was the greatest, who's the GOAT, GOAT, and you and I started having this conversation of, well, is it really about the greatest of all time, or is it really about the greatest of their era? And there's so much history, especially for the Packers, that we really wanted to drive the bus here and say, hey, it's not about comparing all these players. Like, they're not apples to apples comparisons. Arnie Herber versus Bart Starr versus Brett Favre versus Aaron Rodgers is a futile battle, right? They're all greats in their own right. And as we started talking about it and the history of the team, we just thought there was a great opportunity to kind of take a journey through time and explore some of the history of the town and really define who the greatest players of each era are. So I really appreciate you coming on the show. You can follow me, Ryan Bowman, at Ryan Bowman _PWW. And you can follow Mark on Twitter as well, at Mark Beech 2.0. Again, author of The People's Team, the illustrated history of the Green Bay Packers. Now, I've got my copy here. I want to make sure that everybody out there, if you haven't ordered your copy, if you haven't read this, it's amazing. I mean, we're going to be going through a lot of the images and a lot of the pictures. Everything that we're looking at here is courtesy of that book. So just make sure that you guys are out there and ordering that. So with that being said, let's start this off, Mark. I'm pretty excited to go through some of the stuff that we've put together here. So when we talk about the Green Bay Packers, I think we got to start with the town, right? This is not the New York Giants. This is not, the Dallas Cowboys. This is the Green Bay Packers, the smallest market in America, and it's really a unique thing in and of itself. Here we've got a nice another image of Mark's book, The People's Team, an illustrated history of the Green Bay Packers. So again, make sure you guys go out and get that. So when we talk about the town, I mean, let's start with the history. We've got an image here from your book of Green Bay and Fort Howard, circa Brown, Wisconsin, 1867. So maybe set the stage for us a little bit on the history of the town and how it came to be.
Sure. Well, the history of the town dates back to, according to most stories, and the best history we have, it's about in the 1600s. Was discovered by French traders and fur trappers, and who began using it as a place that you could go down the Fox River, or south down the Fox River to the Wisconsin River, and there was a portage, and you could eventually make your way to the Mississippi. So Green Bay became, it was right there on the Great Lakes. Became an important trading point. And this picture is actually looking south from the mouth of the bay into Green Bay. That's Green Bay on your left, and Fort Howard, which is what is now West Green Bay, the west part of Green Bay on your right. And that's the Walnut Street Bridge going over the river, which was built 4 years before this picture was painted. But the layout of Green Bay proper, the grid layout there you can see on the left of the picture was done by Daniel Whitney. Daniel Whitney, the founder of the town, when he originally laid it out as Navarino, which is a city in Greece where the Greek War of Independence was being fought.
Right.
Daniel Whitney was the son of a Minuteman and an incredibly energetic person, and he basically founded the city and started it on its way. But that is, if you live in Green Bay, what side of the river you come from is more important to you than the body of water that you live on, the bay itself. If you're an East Sider or West Sider, it's an important thing. Curly Lambeau was an East Sider, and when he was writing in the 60s, when he was writing articles for the Green Bay Press Gazette or giving interviews about where they should build the new stadium, he was saying it should be on the East Side because he's East Sider.
Right.
Even though I think the West had, and they wound up putting it on the West Side. They had most of the best spots. But the rivalry goes back to where they were going to build the railroad. They wound up putting it through the west part of Green Bay, Fort Howard, because you could basically go north into northeastern Wisconsin from there, but you could also turn west and go to Minnesota and things like that. Was it without, bridging the Fox River. And so the city of Green Bay actually paid for the Walnut Street Bridge to go up because they wanted access to the railroad. But that's the rivalry between the two sides of town. It's a lot of it is, my side is better than your side, but it does date back to where they were going to put the railroad and how that was going to be laid out. But that is Green Bay, and that really is the layout of downtown still follows that basic format. It looks exactly like that right now in a lot of ways. This is a very accurate picture of Green Bay.
And it's funny you mentioned that rivalry because, like, I'm not a Wisconsinite. I'm a Canuck from up north in Canada. But even I've heard of the East-West rivalry. I think even we were talking about, there's a rivalry between Culver's East and Culver's West, and which one's better. Like, it's just a prevalent piece of Green Bay history right up until the day.
The fun thing about the Packers and their history is it's not like the history of the Giants, who were started because the NFL needed a team in New York City. But they're also, it's different than the Montreal Canadiens. It's different than the Boston Celtics or the New York Yankees. There's no team in North American pro sports or really anywhere that I can think of that comes from the land and the people as much as the Packers do. All this stuff you hear about, the Packers being owned by the people, the fans. It's all, and they're the smallest town in the NFL and in pro sports. It's all true, but it all goes a lot deeper than that. The Packers there's no team that's more of the place from which it comes than the Green Bay Packers. They're part of the land. The rivalry between East and West gave rise to the rivalry between Green Bay East and Green Bay West High School in football, which directly gave rise to the Packers. It's really a unique thing in the world of sports that this little tiny town in Wisconsin not only has hung on into the 21st century in the biggest, most profitable pro sports league in North America, but it's also a testament to the team and the town and the way that they are bonded together.
Absolutely. And as we roll through the town history, maybe talk about, one of the most influential people in the town's history that we've got right here.
This is Neil Murphy, he was an Underwood typewriter salesman from Chicago. He was, he'd been affiliated with, I think he'd been an official of a few Packers games in their first season in 1919. But in 1920, he was appointed the team's business manager. And he really was responsible for the Packers becoming a profitable operation. They were just a little bit more than a town sandlot team when Neil Murphy ran the show. And his primary innovation was he got fans. He got the fans of the Packers to build a fence around Hagemeister Park, which is their home field, and they could charge admission. And this helped make them a profitable going concern. And Neil Murphy, his name has sort of been lost to history in terms of like Green Bay and things like that. But this is this is one of the most important guys that the Packers have ever had in their front office.
Well, and we've got some comments rolling in here from Lambo Labos, and he's a sharp dressed man, and I agree. I mean, looks like he's pretty dapper there, and we've got another comment here from Lambo Labo just saying, Mark, you need your own segment on the History Channel about Wisconsin and the Packers history, and I concur because I like to call myself a Packers history nerd, but when you and I started talking and I started reading your book, it was just I was blown away by the depth of knowledge that you have for the state, town, and
there's all sorts of fun things, like the Door County Peninsula, the cliffs that rise from the water in Green Bay on the Door County Peninsula. Those are an extension of the Niagara Escarpment, which begins at Niagara Falls and goes all the way up through Canada and comes back down. And it's a great big arc. I mean, there's just all sorts of cool things about Green Bay and Wisconsin and the city and the team's history.
And you somehow managed to tie it to Canada. So thank you for that, Mark. I appreciate that. I really do.
Well, there is a school of thought that Jean Nicolet de Belleborne, who was supposedly was the first European to see Green Bay, was actually in Winnipeg.
Okay. Well, hey, I'm in Winnipeg.
Story for another time. Yeah.
Most people don't know where that is, but apparently we have some Packers connections here in Winnipeg, aside from the field that we had to play that preseason game in. Let's not go there. But moving on, this was a really interesting story, and Rigney Dwyer and really one of the catalysts that made the Green Bay Packers something more than just a small market team. So maybe tell us a little bit about this story and why this particular guy was so important to the structure that we see today for Green Bay.
If you want a ground zero moment for when the Packers became something more than another sandlot operation, a town team. I mean, 1920 was an incredibly important year. Neil Murphy was running the show in the business office, but Rigney Dwyer was an end who'd played in most of their games in 1919 and was a good pass catcher. Lambeau knew him from their rivalry. Rigney Dwyer was a Green Bay West graduate. Lambeau went to Green Bay East. They played against each other in high school. And Rigney Dwyer had played for them on November 20th, I think, or so. It was the game, 1920. And then a few days later, he was working the night shift at 3 a.m. in the Milwaukee Road Yards, which is now, if you go to Green Bay, there's a big vacant lot over which I think one of the highways runs, and that's the Milwaukee Road Yard is what it was. It was an incredibly important artery in the city of Green Bay. And Rigney Dwyer fell underneath a moving train car at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was, his left arm and his left leg were basically cut off. And the tragedy that befell him is really what sparked this relationship between the team and the town, because Neil Murphy raised, I think, the equivalent of about $50,000, $50,000 to $60,000 by playing a benefit game for Rigney Dwyer after the season had ended. So in early December 1920, they played this game, and they raised all this money. But there was a win one for Dwyer was the rallying cry at the game the Sunday after he got hurt. And a telegram from him was read over the PA system at the field to the fans in the stands. It was nothing more than, I think it was, even the nurses are with you guys, so go get them. It was not, it was not win one for the Gipper, but it was in terms of Packers history, it was a galvanizing moment. And so the Packers have been just another, town teams came and went all the time in Green Bay starting in 1895. Right. But the Packers, even though they were in their second year of operation, they were still playing local competition, an ad hoc schedule against teams that weren't even really teams sometimes. And the moment that coalesced around what happened to Rigney Dwyer was really the moment where the town, the game was sellout. The town really rallied behind the team, and they, 100 years later, the town hasn't really stopped rallying behind the team. And it all started with Rigney Dwyer, who went on to a long career in electoral politics. He was the Register of Deeds in Brown County for, I think until he died in 1944. He was the longest serving public official in Brown County when he died. So
interesting that what would have happened to the Packers if not for that galvanizing moment that you said,
exactly
right? It's kind of that butterfly effect. Like you can go back to all these different points in history and say, wow, it's serendipitous that we're sitting here today talking about the Green Bay Packers as one of the strongest and most successful organizations in professional sports versus this catalyst moment that may never have happened. You never know. Out of tragedy comes some greatness there. I can't even believe this, but Lambo Labo says he's actually been to Winnipeg and he knows about Santa Lucia pizza. So I just had to throw that out there. That he does know Winnipeg, because that is the best pizza in Winnipeg, hands down. Shout out to you, Lambo Labo. Love it. All right, so Whitney Dwyer, we've got this image I really loved, Mark. It kind of brought me back to some of those old comic book ads that I used to see in my dad's old comic stash. So maybe just talk a little bit about what we're looking at here.
This was the benefit game, and they basically split the Packers into two squads. The Northerns, which represented the Northern Paper Company, and the Belleviews, which represented, I believe, a creamery or a dairy. Bellevue ice cream was very popular in town at the time.
Yep.
And it was touted, like every game that the Packers promoted in their first 2 years, it was touted as some sort of championship. Championship for the state of Wisconsin, championship for, the northeastern Wisconsin, championship for the city.
Sure.
Which is what this is. But this is telling people to go to the benefit game and buy tickets. And all sorts of businesses around town chipped in selling tickets. And, they had concessions going at the field that day. They raised, at the time, just a lot of money for Whitney Dwyer, and they gave it all to him, because I think it was another Neil Murphy trick. He had it declared there was some sort of a church charity, but he basically, Rigney got every cent of the money that was raised, and
Crazy.
It was a tremendously, again, it just was an incredibly emotional moment for the town and the team.
Absolutely. It's such a cool story. Like I said, just to look back and see that catalyst that could be the birth of what the Packers have become today.
That's right.
And, when we just kind of fast forwarding a little bit, this was a really interesting image, and you and I were chatting about those retro jerseys and how they're flipped, and this is the actual color. It's not the blue with the yellow emblem. It's the yellow with the blue emblem in the middle.
Right. This was the jersey they wore at their first championship in 1929.
Right.
This is actually the 1930 team picture, and you can tell it's 30, because if you look in the middle row on the far left, Curly Lambeau's on the far left, but then right next to him is Arnie Herber, who was a rookie in 1930. But those are the jerseys they wore for the 1929 championship, which, if you read the Brooklyn Eagle, or I think so, there are some mentions in the Press Gazette to their mud-stained yellow jerseys. And then a yellow jersey with a blue circle with a number in the middle was actually the uniform the Packers wore. And so that those throwbacks that they wear they have it flipped. They have a blue jersey with a gold circle in the middle, and it's just off by a little bit. It's like a photo negative.
I wonder why they did that. I think somebody needs to go ask Jason Wallers what was the decision behind flipping the color scheme of those jerseys. But maybe we'll bite off that one another day, Mark. Kind of moving on, we had some great live action images, and obviously there is no video of these times and of these games, so we really are dependent on some of these live action shots, and maybe walk us through what we're watching here.
This is the only shot that I could find, and it's in my book, of the 1929 de facto championship game at the Polo Grounds on November 24th between the Giants and the Packers. And if you want a reason for why they might have gotten those jerseys backwards, is because they don't look golden in this picture. I mean,
right.
That's Benny Friedman of the Giants being tackled. His helmet's on the ground. He's carrying the ball, though, in the middle of the photo there, and there's a flying tackle being applied by a member of the Packers. Friedman was a great quarterback, a great passer in his day, and the Giants were favored. I think they were actually 5-2 favorites or something. They were favored to win this game. Both teams were undefeated. Green Bay still had 3 games to play after they won this game, and the Giants still had several to go too. But both teams were undefeated, and they figured they were going to be undefeated for the rest of the season. And the Packers, dominated the Giants in this game. They won 22-6. It was probably one of the most important games in the early history of the Packers, because after they won this game and they went on the road trip, they went 2-0-1, and I think on the rest of the road trip they tied the team in Philadelphia. I can't remember their name right now, but they basically they were greeted by 20,000 people in Milwaukee when they got back on the train, or in Green Bay when they got back on the train. They couldn't believe the turnout. 20,000 is more than half of the population of Green Bay
Yeah.
at the time. And it was at midnight when the train got back, or 9 a.m. to midnight, 9 p.m. to midnight. It was just a tremendously exciting time. And this game was, there was a broadcast of this game, I think, on a radio station in Green Bay. I think they were doing a grid graph of the game, which is everybody would go to a town hall or a town square, and they would watch. They move the guys up around in the grid graph. It was a tremendously important time.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of the Lambeau era, which is the era we're kind of exploring today, like you said, this is one of those most important games that came through that era, never mind Green Bay Packers history. So really, really cool image here. And again, you can find all these pictures in Mark's book, The People's Team, An Illustrated History of the Green Bay Packers. I'm just going to throw a link up to where you can purchase that at Amazon in the chat. So all you folks out there, make sure you go out and grab that. It's a great read. It's been super fun just kind of sifting through and figuring out things that we want to talk about here. So I highly recommend that for anybody that's interested in Packers history. I thought this was a really cool image, Mark, because not much has changed, right? I've got a share over there that, I paid a pretty penny for that looks very similar to this one. So, maybe tell us a little bit about this image and the history behind the Packers actually, selling stocks.
So in 1922, the Packers almost went under. They were not part of the packing company sponsored by Acme or Indian Packing anymore. They were owned by Curly Lambeau. 1922 was really the first year that Curly Lambeau was he'd always been sort of the captain of the Packers, but they'd had different coaches. But in 22, he became their driving force. He became their coach as well as their captain. And he was really the guy who got them back into the league. They'd been kicked out, which is something I think we're going to get to a little later. But in 22, they just had some disastrous weather. And they had some games that they played, but they got nothing out of them financially. Neil Murphy was not running the show, the business operation anymore. And the Packers were going to go under. And the Green Bay Press-Gazette and the person of Arthur Turnbull, Andy Turnbull, who was the publisher, stepped in and told them, you finish out the season, and I will find a way to make you guys financially profitable. We'll spot you the money. We'll make this work, because he'd been out in the world and he'd seen, what a sort of even in 1922, and for most of the 20s, except for a few years there, Green Bay has always been the smallest town in the league.
Right.
Always been the smallest town in the NFL. And it's not really even been close. So even when the NFL was a small town operation, the Packers were the smallest of the small towns. And so in 22,
we've always been a little brother, right?
Right.
It's yeah.
In 22, and it looked like they were going to go out of business, and Turnbull stepped in. And the paper, in more than just the form of their George Whitney Calhoun became their sort of their patron saint. They figured out a plan to sell stock, and they held their first stock sale in the late summer, early autumn of 1923. And this is a certificate from that sale, $5. And I think buying a certain number of shares got you season passes to a box at the field. It was just but it put the Packers on a profitable basis, and it allowed Lambeau to go out and get people. A thing at which he proved to be especially good at, as we'll see. But 1923 was the first of their 5 stock sales, and probably for that reason, because it was the first, it was the most important, because it established a framework for everything that comes after.
Well, exactly, and you look, it was $5 plus you get season tickets. I mean, I'd take that deal hands down right now. I mean, I paid, I think, $250 US plus an admin fee because I'm from Canada, and I got no chance of getting season tickets. I don't even think I'm getting on the waiting list at this point. So, it's quite interesting to look back and just see, some of the steps that they had to take to remain profitable and be what they are today. This was an interesting one that we talked about, and we called it the Lost Championship. So we've got Mr. Hudson there, looking like maybe he's not feeling so well or dropping a pass there. So maybe walk us through what's happening on this play.
Well, Don Hudson, towards the end of the 38 season, had suffered a pretty severe leg or hip injury. Exactly what the injury was, I can't recall off the top of my head. But he missed a significant chunk of time at the end of the season. They were very good. But my contention is that this should have been the 7th championship of the Lambeau era. This is, they had a really good team in 38. But Hudson got hurt. And, they got drubbed by the Giants in the this is from the championship game. He got in at 2 points in the championship game. They put him near the end of the first half, and they put him in at the end of the game when it was pretty much a lost cause. And he couldn't get anything done. But this was actually a drop. For all the photo caption information we found on it was that there was a drop. This is the 38 championship game at the Polo Grounds against the Giants, and Hudson played both ways. He was only 6 foot and 175 pounds, but he was an end on offense, and he was always a tight end. He was not split wide.
Right.
He played against the line, and on defense, he was a defensive end. And the punishment that he was taking was, he'd been a rookie. He'd been in the league for, I want to say this was his 4th year by this point, 35, 36. Yeah, this was 4 years. And it was becoming, I think, a bit too much. And it's no accident that Lambeau went out and drafted a guy after this game who was going to help them at the defensive end position and let them move Don Hudson away from the line.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a bit as we roll through some of the greatest players of each era. But I think that's incredibly important to point out, and why we look at it as the GOAT, GOTE, the greatest of their era, and not the GOAT, the greatest of all time, is because you can't compare these guys. Yeah. Don Hudson's out there playing defensive end and essentially tight end.
So in that 29 championship game, 10 of the 11 Packers played 60 minutes.
Exactly.
And the one guy who didn't got taken out for a minute or two at the end of the game. It was, he played 58 minutes, So this was Iron Man football, and Hudson played both ways. And I think that, a lot of players he played with considered him not to be, the greatest player of his era because of his liabilities as a defensive player, which Lambeau solved by moving him. But this game was the reason. Sorry.
No worries. And then lastly, on the town history, this was a pretty interesting image, and a very important man sitting on the right there. So maybe tell our viewers who we're looking at.
Right. I have no brief for the gentleman in the cream-colored coat.
Yeah.
But the guy with the sweater around his neck was George Whitney Calhoun, who is a direct descendant of the founder of the city of Green Bay, Daniel Whitney. The Packers go all the way back in Green Bay. There's all sorts of wonderful ties between the Packers and the town that they're from. And George Whitney Calhoun is one of them. He was born in Green Bay, moved away when he was very young to Buffalo with his family, and grew up in Buffalo, where he became a great organizer of teams. Suffered horribly from rheumatoid arthritis for most of his adult life. Didn't get around well, but he came back to Green Bay as the Telegraph editor of the Press Gazette, which is equivalent to the Wire editor now, the guy who would add an AP copy that you put in the paper. But he was also basically the Packers manager, their de facto press agent. He published the Dope Sheet, which was their game day program for years. He wrote the Dope Sheet. He probably wrote most of the articles on the Packers in some of those early papers. He was not the sports editor. That was a different guy, Val Schneider, who might have played a role in the birth of the Packers as well, but we don't know. But George Whitney Calhoun was there the whole time, and he was there into the 40s. Developed a tremendously bitter relationship with Lambeau, but in the early days, he was, he and Lambeau were two of the engines that kept the Packers going, and he was also, as I talking to David Neft, the guy who wrote the Baseball Encyclopedia. George Whitney Calhoun is one of the first historians in pro football history. And so it's tremendously important in that way as well. A lot of the archival information that they have at the Pro Football Hall of Fame is due to this man right here.
Well, and it's important, right? Because we're sitting here talking about the history. So having him kind of kick that off is a pretty important step. And, I think we would be remiss if we didn't really focus on Curly Lambeau himself, right? This is,
right.
he is, if we're talking about the GOATs, I mean, Curly Lambeau is going to be, 1A on that list. So I thought this was a pretty cool image here, back from the University of Notre Dame. We've got Mr. Lambeau right up here near the top left. Maybe talk about what this image and when we're looking at and kind of the context there.
So that is the 1918 Notre Dame football team. Newt Rockney's first season as coach. Lambeau was primarily the fullback, and he played next to the left halfback, who was George Gipp. Win one for the Gipper, who's right there to Lambeau's left. Lambeau, by most accounts, scored the first touchdown for Rockney that season, though some sources credit it to Gipp. He was a good player for him. But the 1918 season was suspended partway through. That was during World War I. It was suspended in October for the Spanish influenza epidemic. And they didn't play football for a month. And they came back in November. But Lambeau played for Notre Dame for one season. He went to Notre Dame for one semester. But he was forever a Notre Dame man. If you scratch a Packer great from those Lambeau years, there typically is some sort of Notre Dame tie.
Sure.
Even with Don Hudson, who went to Alabama, but whose coach went to Notre Dame.
Right.
So Notre Dame Lambeau was only there for a brief time, but it was tremendously important to him, and remained so throughout his life.
And then we've got the classic football pose of this era, right?
That's right.
I'm wondering who's on the receiving end there sometimes, and I'm maybe questioning the footwork a little bit there, but it's interesting. I loved this image just because this is obviously Green Bay, right? Like
I always like to think that the clenched left hand was not form. It was because it was so freaking cold that day.
Yeah, and you can see it here, right? You've got the stepping out in the snow, like it looks like it's taken out in the backyard in the snow somewhere. I love it. It's such an interesting context. And the helmets, right? Like we've got all the PPE and the safety gear and the concussion protocols, and again, you can't compare a Curly Lambeau with a guy that's playing today, and with all of the rules and things that are kind of centered around. I think my shorts are thicker than that helmet. So, I can't imagine that we're talking apples to apples here. This was another real cool one, just because, you've got the Acme Packers sweaters on there. You've got Mr. Lambeau right in the middle, but maybe give us a little context on this one, Mark.
So that's the 1921 Packers, who were known as the Acme Packers for part of the season. Not much of it. The Packers, they were sponsored by Indian Packing in 1919, which became Acme Packing in 1920. Acme Packing was continuing the sponsorship into 21. And then because the packing business was failing so badly after the war, there was not the call for canned meat that there had been during the war. The Packers were the ones who started to move themselves away from association with the packing company, to the point of which Lambeau actually started to, he was trying to find a way to name them something else, I think. But he began referring to them in the paper in all sorts of different ways. But Packers was the one that stuck, thankfully. But this is 1921. This is their first year in the NFL, the APFA at the time, and that's a team picture. And it's wonderful for all sorts of reasons. Not least of which is the mascot in the very front and the middle. The little kid, or the guy with crepe around his nose or his face.
I was going to say, what happened to that young man there? I mean,
it's a good look, yeah.
Yeah,
well, in the early days, like you talk about how thin the helmet is. In the early days, football players wore long hair because it was thought that the long hair helped protect your head, which is just unthinkable. Yeah,
extra cushioning, and no face guards, and I'm sure they didn't take him out for a concussion protocol at that point after he got smacked in the head. So, just a different world altogether in terms of stacking these guys up. This was an interesting one because I think we've got 3 of our GOAT nominees all in one picture here. So I can recognize Mr. Hudson on the left and Mr. Lambeau on the right, but who do we got in the middle there, Mark?
In the middle is Cecil Isbell, who had one of the great truncated careers in pro football history. He played for, I think, 4 or 5 seasons. There are some rumors that I could never confirm that there were some family pressures to get out of the game. he cited watching Lambeau cut guys who were important parts of the team that, he just came through and like emotionlessly or passionlessly cut guys from the squad. But Cecil Isbell, during his 4 to 5 years in the league, was a better passer than Sammy Baugh or Sid Luckman. Is a better, one of the Packers' best running backs. He was just a hard-nosed, all-around player. Herbert was known as an artist of the long ball. He was a great long ball passer. Isbell could throw long, but he could also throw short and with touch, and he was much more accurate. I think had Isbell played like longer, he would have certainly been in the Hall of Fame, but he did not. He cut his career short, and he went to be the backfield coach I think at Purdue, which was his alma mater.
Cool. Well, it sounds like he was ahead of his time in terms of the passing game, but this one cracks me up. Which one of these guys is Larry McCarron and Aaron Nagler? Now, I can't. I think if you saw The Rock out there, you just look at that pinky finger and you know which one he is, right? So we'll get to that era at some point, Labo. Don't you worry. And then lastly, on the Lambeau piece, we've got kind of an interesting tidbit here. This is the actual franchise certificate that I think he spent $250 on to be an actual official NFL franchise, which I think cost me the same amount as my one share that stands up there today.
So nobody knows what their franchise fee is. That's just the certificate they got when they were readmitted to the NFL in 1922.
Okay, gotcha.
They were kicked out in 1921 for using 3 Notre Dame players. They were actually kicked out of the NFL, though the season was already over. They came back and they were readmitted before the next season began. So the Packers actually spent 6 or 8 months or so out of pro football.
Interesting.
They were using Notre Dame players in the game, which was a common practice, but one that the NFL was specifically organized to get rid of. They did not want to be using collegiate players. They thought it sullied the game. Gave pro football a bad name, it is one reason they had a bad public image. But somebody at some point scrawled in the upper left-hand corner there, cost $50. But nobody knows when that was or who did that. I have a suspicion it was probably Curly Lambeau. I was told that Lee Remmel, the former Packers PR director, described Lambeau one time as a congenital liar. He was not a totally honest man, given to exaggeration. He was a tremendously energetic guy and a tremendously single-minded guy. Like the Packers succeeded and thrived through the force of Curly Lambeau's will, but he was not a perfect man. And nobody knows how much the Packers paid. There's no record of it in the Pro Football offices or at the Hall of Fame. So nobody knows how much they paid to get back into the NFL. There was somebody scrawled cost $50 up there, but I don't know why they did that. We don't know.
Very cool. So moving on to our GOATs, getting on to the mission of finding the greatest players of each era. We've got our first nominee, Mr. Vern Lewellen. So maybe talk about him a little bit and why is he considered potentially one of the greatest of his era? Well,
Vern was widely considered. He was a halfback, Nebraska farm boy. Went to the University of Nebraska. Nebraska beat Notre Dame twice when Notre Dame was really good. I think they beat the Four Horsemen. And then Jim Crowley, one of those Four Horsemen, was the guy who passed Vern Lewellen's name on to Curly Lambeau because he was a gifted player and he was a gifted punter. He's not in the Hall of Fame primarily because he played in the pre-stats era and nobody knows how great he was. There's no measurement of it. But Johnny Blood, I think at the time he went into the Hall of Fame, made the comment that it's a joke that Vern Lewellen is not here. He scored 51 touchdowns in his career, which I think went from 24 to 33. In his 9 years in the NFL, his 51 touchdowns were more than anybody else. He scored more points, and he was a dominating punter in an era when punters, as Cliff Crystal, the Packers historian, told me, in an era when punters dominated the game the way quarterbacks do today. The football was rounder. and if you had the ball in bad field position in your own territory, you'd kick on first down because there'd be nobody back to receive the punt, and you'd get the rolls. And so it was a way to flip field position, and nobody was better at that than at the time than Vern Lewellen. Besides Sammy Baugh, he's probably one of the greatest punters in early NFL history. And he just, there are 3 championship games. There are 3 championship teams in the 29, 30, and 31.
Yep.
He was widely acknowledged by everybody who wrote about those teams to be the best player on those teams. And that he's not in the Hall of Fame is just I know everybody's up in arms about Leroy Butler. I am too. But Vern Lewellen should be in the Hall of Fame. Vern Lewellen should be in the Hall of Fame.
Shout it, Mark. Shout it.
The man belongs there.
Well, we'll have to start some sort of hashtag to get this going, because I know everybody's on Leroy Butler, and I'm with them too. But it seems like Vern Lewellen might have a case to get in there first. So moving on, we've got Mr. Cal Hubbard here, and I thought this was such a cool image, just the old football stance. He's got the slick back hair. So tell us a little bit about Mr. Hubbard.
He's a wildly interesting guy. This is actually a picture of Hubbard when he played with the Giants, I think in the 30s.
Okay.
But I think he'd been with the Giants before he came to the Packers in the 20s.
Yep.
He was one of 3 Hall of Famers signed by Curly Lambeau in the summer of 1929. There was a 5-week period in 1929, starting in late July, that completely changed the trajectory of the franchise. They signed Cal Hubbard, Johnny Blood, and Mike Mikulski. 3 guys who went in, 2 of whom, Hubbard and Blood, went in the first class of the Hall of Fame. Mikulski went in class 2. It's no accident they won a championship the next year. Hubbard is the only man who's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame and the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown as an umpire. He went under a long and great career as an umpire and then supervisor of umpires in the American League. He was described as a man mountain, listed anywhere from 6'2" to 6'6" and 238 to like 280 pounds, but he was like 6'2" or 6'4" and 250 pounds. And he was just a mean, tough, hard-nosed player, a great defensive player, and just a road grader on offense. I mean, the Packers, they really they were physically the most dominant team in the league for a period of time in the 20s and 30s.
Sure. I don't think I'd want him barreling down on me. That might be a little intimidating. I mean, I'm not a small
game. He went to, I can't remember what school he went to, but his first game he returned a kickoff for a touchdown. He was a fast guy too. He was just a great player.
Now that's one thing that's still transmittable: big, strong, fast. That's still the formula today. It still wins in the NFL, So as much as things change, and as much as we can't compare a lot of things, the big, strong, fast thing still holds true. So, going on to one of my favorites here, and I don't think you can ever find a better football name than Johnny Blood. So, one of the things that drew me to this guy was he was just an enigmatic character, right? Like he was almost the Chuck Norris of his time. His feats and his accomplishments were just exaggerated beyond belief, to the point where it was just, he was a myth and a legend almost in and of himself. So, but maybe talk a little bit about Johnny Blood and how he got the name and things like that.
The vagabond halfback.
Yeah,
he's from Wisconsin.
Yeah,
graduated River Falls High School at the age of 14. He was a raconteur. He was a polymath. He was a hard drinker. I mean, the guy was just a tremendously interesting guy. He developed a great reputation at St. John's College in Minnesota for reciting poetry and for writing poetry. And just fought professionally a few times in Minneapolis when he was working for the Minneapolis Tribune with one of his friends. And it was they went to a tryout for a local semi-pro team in Minneapolis at one point in the 20s. And there was a marquee that was advertising Rudolph Valentino in Blood and Sand. And I think he was ineligible, or he was too young. I can't remember what it was, but he told his buddy, "You be blood and I'll be sand," or "I'll be blood and you be sand." I'm sorry. And so he was Johnny Blood. There's no record of anybody named Sand playing for any team, any of those semi-pro teams that he played for in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I think I think his buddy got the short end of the stick, being Sand.
Right.
I mean, he obviously Johnny was pretty sharp.
He worked his way up from the semi-pro ranks in Minneapolis to he was playing in Duluth. I think he played in Pottsville at some point, and might have been in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan at one point. But eventually, when he made his way to the Packers, it was with Lambeau, who believed in the forward pass more than anybody in pro football, because pro football was the 3 yards in the cloud of dust game. The ball was not easy to pass. It was a rounder football. There were rules on passing. Like if you threw an incompletion in the end zone in the early days, it was a turnover. So Aaron Rodgers. Imagine Aaron Rodgers throwing incomplete to Devontae Adams, and they on first down and the ball's turned over because it's incomplete. It just there were people didn't do it, and the Packers would do it.
Right.
And because they would, Blood was the first great deep threat in the history of pro football. He was fast and strong, and he could catch, and he was just a tremendous player. And he's sort of been lost to history because these are the best pictures of Johnny Blood right here, the ones where he's standing against a grove of trees. It's not, he's not Ray Nitschke calling out defensive signals against the Bears. He's
sure.
It's a little bit of the romance has been lost, but Johnny Blood was a tremendously interesting guy, and just one of the true greats in early Packers history.
Yeah, and I just love this image. Like we're talking, almost 100 years ago, or just over 100 years ago, and this is a pretty crisp image. And if you want to get more images, we're gonna plug the People's Team, an illustrated history of the Green Bay Packers. Link is up in the chat, folks. Make sure you get it. All the images we're walking through here today are courtesy of Mark's book, so make sure you guys go and check that out. So moving on from Johnny Blood, we're gonna go to Arnie Herber. So this is quite an exciting image that we have here, the jump pass, as we call it. So maybe walk us through Arnie Herber and why he's one of the greatest of all time, or one of the greatest of his era.
A Green Bay guy, went to Green Bay West High School. Another guy who's his family worked in the rail yards. I think his father or his uncle, somebody was horribly injured at the Milwaukee Road Yards. It was not uncommon for guys that switch in the
sounds like that happens a lot over there.
Well, it was tremendously hazardous work. I have a whole section in my book about what a dangerous job working in the rail yards was.
Totally.
But Arnie was the guy who decided that life was not for him. College was not really for him either. He could never stick at Wisconsin. I wound up going, I think, to some school in Ohio for a while, in Denver, in Colorado. But eventually, he came back to Green Bay, and he was playing with the Packers in 1930. And he was, played a few games at quarterback, but he became a left halfback, which became the primary passer in Lambeau's offense. And he, Herber was a master at the deep ball. He was, as we discussed with Cecil Isbell, Isbell could throw all sorts of touch passes and accurate passes, but Herber could sling it. Herber, if you wanted a guy who could throw it up there and throw it downfield, it was Arnie Herber. And that's really how he made his name. And luckily for him, he had guys like Don Hudson and Johnny Blood to throw to.
It doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt having elite talent and some of the best deep threats in NFL history catching the ball for me, for sure. So moving on from Arnie Herber, we've got Mr. Clark Hinkle. So tell us a little bit about why he would be considered one of the greatest of the Lambeau era.
Well, the guys who played with him and Don Hudson all think that Hinkle was a better football player.
Interesting.
Because Hinkle was hard-nosed. His clashes with Bronco Nagurski are legendary. He knocked Nagurski out of the game one time, and as a second-year player. He was the NFL leader in rushing for the long time, through the 1940s almost. I think when he retired in 41 or 42, he led the NFL in rushing, career leader. He was just a incredibly important guy in Packers history. The comment on Don Hudson was that his idea of playing defense was, I think Mikulski said it, was to let somebody else make the tackle. Not Clark Hinkle. He was a blunt instrument who sought out contact and sought out the end zone. like few players before him. Cecil Isbell, who you can see in the background of that picture,
Yeah.
that he used to get so worked up before a game, it was almost like a madman. And after a game, if they lost, he would be sitting in his locker crying and weeping like a baby. Hinkle was just a great all-around football player, kicker, place kicker, runner, passer, defensive player, and the guys who played with him all loved him. And so, if you talk to guys who played with him, they'll tell you that Hinkle was the better player. Don Hudson was so much better than the rest of the league. I'm not so sure that's possible, but Hinkle is certainly one of the best players in Packers history by far.
And this is quite an astounding attendance that they've got at this game. Where is this game being played, Mark?
This is the 38 championship game that they lost at the Polo Grounds to the Giants.
Right.
So that is it was a big game. It was an important game. We have friends here. I live in Westchester County, New York, and we're friends with one of the Mara daughters or granddaughters.
Cool.
So she used to hand out tickets to Giants games on the street corners in the Bronx where they lived. So more than a few people there are probably there on free tickets.
For sure.
There was the Packers were drawing crowds. That was one of the great strengths for the Packers. They were a great road draw. And so when there were, pushes to like move them out of the league and things like that, like they kept the Packers around because the Packers drew well all around the country. They drew well in Chicago. They drew well in New York. And that was a big deal in the early days of the NFL when you were looking for draws.
Well, and some things don't change, right? If we can go back to anytime, nobody wants to give up a Packers home game when the Packers come to town to go play in Europe or Mexico or wherever the heck else they want to play internationally. So, the Packers are still pretty much the best draw in the NFL, if you ask me. Now, we've talked a lot about Mr. Hudson leading up to this, and obviously, I think he's one of the most recognizable names in terms of being a greatest of their era. But maybe talk about, some of the things that he was able to do on the field compared to the rest of the league, as you touched on.
Well, he was one of the fastest guys in the NFL. He was not, I think the legend is that he was running 900-yard dashes at Alabama. There's no evidence of that, except that maybe he did it in practice, track practice. But he was a fast guy. He made his name in the 1935 Rose Bowl. He caught like two long touchdown passes in Alabama's win over Stanford in the 35 Rose Bowl on New Year's Day. And, it was a tremendously sought after. His coach in college was a guy named Frank Thomas, who, you'd think Alabama, no connection to Notre Dame. But Frank Thomas had a connection to Notre Dame. Frank Thomas had gone to Notre Dame. And so he's the one who tipped Lambeau off. Lambeau was at the Shrine game, the East-West Shrine game in San Francisco. He wasn't at the Rose Bowl. But Thomas is the one who told him how great Hudson was. And so that's how Lambeau found Don Hudson, was through his Notre Dame connections. This is Hudson at Wrigley Field, probably in the late 30s, early 1940s, when he was already, 1935 to 39, which I think is, 39 is the year where this era ends, with their last championship of that, the early Lambeau years. He was by far the best player in the league, the best receiver, certainly.
Yeah.
And the World War II did something else to his legacy. But, Don Hudson was, incredibly important in the history of not only the NFL, but of the Packers as well. His first play was an 83-yard touchdown pass from Arnie Herber. He was being covered by a guy named Beatty Feathers, Chicago Bears halfback, who the year before could have laid claim to be the fastest man in the NFL because he was the first NFL back to rush for 1,000 yards. Beatty Feathers was covering Don Hudson when Hudson broke free on the first play from scrimmage and caught an 83-yard touchdown pass from Arnie Herber, and in his first game in the NFL, in his first play. And really, he never looked back. Hudson's legacy in Green Bay and beyond is gigantic.
Yeah, and when you look at this image, I get a kick out of this. Like he's just the grin. He's just hanging out on the bench, just a character, right? So,
I like to think that behind that knee he's got raised up there is a Camel cigarette in one of his hands.
I was going to say a cigarette or maybe a flask with some whiskey in it, something like that,
Right.
would be very apt for him for sure. And moving on from Hudson, but maybe connected to Hudson a little bit, and maybe what allowed him to be the greatest or one of the greatest of his era is Mr. Larry Craig.
So as we talked about earlier, Hudson was taking a horrible beating, playing end both ways as a defensive end. And so in the 1939 draft, Lambeau took Larry Craig from the University of South Carolina to be his quarterback on offense. And as the Packers quarterback, Larry Craig never threw a pass from 1939. I think he was there until 46 or 48. Larry Craig never threw a pass. What he did was he was a blocking back and a devastating blocking back on offense. On defense, he played defensive end. And he allowed Don Hudson to shift into the secondary, where Hudson, I think by the time he retired, had 30 interceptions after having basically zero, his first 4 or 5 years in the league. But Larry Craig's, he was just a beast on defense, a big, strong, tough guy. I think his nickname was Superman because of his physique. He was the guy who allowed Don Hudson to continue his career. Was a very good defensive player for the Packers. There's some people who think that Larry should be in the Hall of Fame on his own merits as a defensive player. I probably think there are a few Packers who deserve to go in ahead of him. But he's a tremendously important guy in Packers history, and not many Packers fans know that.
Yeah, and personally, like I hadn't heard much about him until you kind of gave the context on how important he was in terms of enabling Don Hudson to extend that career out and not take the punishment in the trenches that he had been up until that point. So very, very, very important. If maybe Don Hudson isn't in this category if not for Larry Craig.
That's right.
And lastly, we've got Cecil Isabel, who we've touched on a few times as we've highlighted some other players. And this is a pretty interesting shot of him. I think that's him carrying the ball right there. So maybe talk a little bit about Cecil Isabel and what he brings to the table and why he should be considered one of the greatest of the era.
This is the 39 championship game where they pasted the Giants, who had beaten them the year before by not much. But this is in Milwaukee State Fair Park, a championship game that was supposed to be played in Green Bay, but the NFL State Fair Park held 7,000 more people, and so they held it in Milwaukee and not Green Bay, which the city of Green Bay was not happy about. Isbell is shown here. He was a great ball carrier, but he was a tremendous passer, and his combination with Don Hudson was really sublime. I think I've got it in my book. The number of touchdown passes that Isbell threw to Hudson is I think it's was 33 or 36 in just a few years. But yeah, that's Clark Hinkle all the way to the left side of that photo coming into frame. But Isbell was him passing and Hudson receiving was just a devastating combination, and it's why the Packers were champions in '39.
Awesome. And these are a lot of great players, right? Again, we're looking at the Lambeau era here between 1919 and 1939. Tons of great players that we got to talk about, but this is where we got to whittle it down, Mark, right? Not everybody can be considered a greatest of their era or a GOAT in their own right. So, obviously it's the Lambeau era. So Lambeau is going to be one of the GOATs by default. He's the namesake. So he's in. So if I had to get you to pick one of these guys out of all the nominees that we've put forward, who's your guy?
Well, I think you got to go with Don Hudson. It's an easy pick in a lot of ways, but it's a tough pick in some ways because I'd love to pick Vern Lewellen, who was the best player on a 3P team. At the same time, he was the district attorney of Brown County, Wisconsin. A very interesting guy in his own right. There's too many guys to pick from. How do you not pick? All the guys who played with him said that Clark Hinkle was a better player. So why don't I take Clark Hinkle? But you got to go with Don Hudson. He's just his influence on the game is felt today. What he did in pro football is, he was, I think there's the Ken Burns documentary on baseball, and I think it's George Will who talks about Babe Ruth being like an Everest in Kansas. And Don Hudson was like that for the Packers. He was so far above everybody else, not only at his position, but in the rest of the game that I think you've got to go with him.
You'll get no argument from me. I mean, two guys stuck out to me. Hudson was absolutely one of them. But I'm going to go a different direction with mine. And I'm going to say Johnny Blood, first of all, the name, then you've got the man, the myth, the legend, and then you put his on-field, accomplishments all rolled into one. And he kind of embodies greatness to me. So right. I'm going to go with Johnny Blood. And that really brings us to the three greatest of the era. We've got Curly Lambeau, obviously. We've got Mr. Don Hudson, and we've got Mr. Johnny Blood. Those are the greatest of their era in terms of the Lambeau era. It's been super interesting going through this era. And on our next episode, which is going to go next Thursday, same bat time, same bat channel, we're going to explore the 40s and the 50s. So, I hope all of you guys will come along for the ride with us. Again, we've got, a lot of stuff planned for it. And as we get into the Lambeau era, we might look at some iconic plays and some things like that add some extra context to this. Again, you can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Beech 2.0. We'll just pop that up there. And you can follow me at Ryan Bowman _PWW. Of course, if you like what we've been doing on this show, make sure you follow Game On Wisconsin. Make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We want to get the word out. We're trying to bring you guys lots of content through the off season and into the season. So make sure you're tuning in and coming back for next week. We've got a couple of comments here that maybe I'll throw out. We've got Labo who's been kind of just following along with us. He says he feels like a student again in the best of ways. And what a fantastic addition to the Game On Wisconsin portfolio of shows. Fulfills a need. Phenomenal debut show. So listen, thank you guys. We super appreciate you coming along for the ride. And I think we've got some exciting stuff for you. And hopefully you'll join us next week, 7:30. With that, let's take us out. Go Pack, go.